Oh, great. So welcome, everyone. This is the Joint Transportation Oversight Committee, which hasn't met for a few years. So just welcome back. It's a Wednesday, September 27th. And I just thought I would say the reason really to meet is because the flooding from July has had a tremendous impact on our state's transportation infrastructure and budget. So we really wanted to get some updates from the agency. And this is a newly configured group since I think the last time there was a meeting in 2014, if I'm not mistaken. So it's been a while. So thank you. I know several of you have been meeting already. So I would like to try to start and end on time. So just to we're going to have an overview in just a moment from Anthea Dexter Cooper from Ledge Council, and then we'll have Secretary Flynn and others give us an overview of the flooding impacts and response activities, and we'll move into the impact of flooding on the FY24 transportation program budget, and then getting an update on some of the vehicle incentive programs, some changes and adjustments that were made there as a result of the flooding. And then we have two items related to airports, the Franklin County Airport and Caledonia Airport. So I'm hoping with your help that we can move through the items and ask some questions, but it's out of here by 3 o'clock. But I also want to make sure because I have another meeting. Good. Great. So I want to invite Anthea Dexter Cooper up to just kind of ground us in our work, especially since this committee hasn't convened in a long time. So welcome. Good to see you, Anthea.
Nice to see you as well. So for the record, Anthea Dexter Cooper from the Office of Legislative Counsel. I'm just briefly going to talk about sort of the authority that the Joint Transportation Oversight Committee, known as JTOC, has. And I really love these agendas that the Joint Fiscal Committee prepares because they have your statutory language in the back, which is great. So the main statute that deals with JTOC is 19 VSA section 12B. It creates JTOC and it says who is on JTOC. So you all are not on JTOC because the Committee on Committees or the Speaker appointed you separate and apart from your other legislative duties, but because of your positions as the chairs on the money committees and the two transportation committees, you are on this committee as well. They come as a package deal. The chair is also dictated by statute. It alternates between bienniums, and this year, this biennium, Representative Coffey, as the chair of House Transportation, is the chair of JTOC. Subsection B talks about when the committee can meet, which is during adjournment, and it talks about the compensation and who you have the assistance of, which is going to be the Joint Fiscal Office, Legislative Operations, and Legislative Counsel. Subsection C, which I think is sort of the most important section in 12B, talks about the crux of what the committee has oversight of, which is legislative oversight of the transportation fund revenues collection. We got our money there. And the operation and administration of the Agency of Transportation construction, paving, and rehabilitation programs. This is pretty much, if you're thinking about the titles that the transportation committees deal with, this is more Title 19 highways than it is Title 23, more Title 5 airports and railroads than it is Title 23 Department of Motor Vehicles. Subsection D talks about what the secretary needs to submit to the Joint Fiscal Office for distribution. And then that closes out the main section on JTOC. You've got two more sections in your agenda. I also, more for my own curiosity than anything else, look to see how many other times in statute Joint Transportation Oversight Committee appears. It only appears in statute in 9 sections. 3 of those sections that you don't have in your agenda deal with the approval of JTOC in lieu of the General Assembly for purposes of transfers or acquisitions over that $500,000 threshold. You're going to be talking about that a lot when you get to the Franklin County Airport. There is a couple sections that deal with notice to JTOC, but not action by JTOC. That's going to be related to rail banking that the Secretary of Transportation does, or if there is a need to add new projects to the transportation program in order to secure federal earmark or to get a discretionary grant. And then there are a couple that require JTOC approval upon notice related to things like if there's going to be a loss of federal funding. So if we're looking for a theme here, JTAC exists to be the recipient of information when the General Assembly is not in session related to budgetary components of the Agency of Transportation's work. And it serves as the delegated to authority, because it's not the committees of the General Assembly that act, but General Assembly writ large, to take limited action in terms of approving certain things in the stead of the General Assembly when the General Assembly is not in session. So it's pretty narrow and limited, and that's probably why it hasn't met in many years. The main instance that you'll hear JTAC sort of throughout the halls of the building is usually with the JTAC transfer, which if you look at the JTAC transfer language doesn't even use JTAC, but it was how the transfer has historically been done. So that's where you got your statutory framework, why you, 5 individuals and your 6th who's not here, make up the committee and what it is that you have the authority to do. Happy to answer questions, but I think you're probably way more excited to hear from the agency than me talking about how many times JTAC appears in statute.
Any questions for Anthea? Great. It's always great to hear, to clarify what we're doing here today and what we are limited and allowed to do. So great.
And I'll stick around if there are questions for me later.
Thank you so much. So great. So, so now, Secretary Flynn, come on up, please. Thank you. And doing yours. And I know you have a number of people in the room here, so welcome. And thank you for taking the time away from, it's been a really busy, unusually busy construction season. So thank you so much. And I just want to say for the record, I've been following the work really closely of the agency, and I've appreciated getting the regular situation report updates. And just, I also sit on the Rail Advisory Council, and I've just seen the tremendous work that you and the agency and the team.
It's amazing the progress they made in such a short time.
It's in such a short time.
That rail division, the rail was back in like 19 days. And when I look at the pictures, I wouldn't think it'd be back in a year.
Yes, you know? Yes. So
Unbelievable.
I think I speak for many of us, just our appreciation to you and the agency.
Yeah. Good work.
All of you. So thank you. And turn it over to you. I think we have about a half an hour, and I think we'd love to leave some time for questions too.
Thank you, Chair Coffey, for the record, and Secretary Agency of Transportation. And let me start with online. Online, we have Commissioner, Department of Motor Vehicles, and Michelle Boomhauer, Director of Policy Planning and International Development. In the room with me are Jana Morse, the Director of Finance and Administration, Bradley Kuchenberger, the CFO, Patrick Murphy, who runs the EV program and has a presentation, Ernie Patno from District Maintenance and Fleet, Todd Law from District Maintenance and Fleet, Aaron Sisson, Deputy Chief Engineer, and Ann Gamble, Chief Engineer. I believe that is our entourage. So again, thank you for having us today. I know you received the PowerPoints in advance of the meeting, so I'm just going to skim through the highlights of them so that we have some time, maximize time that we have perhaps with dialogue. I think one thing that's important to note, obviously this started on Friday, July 7th. That day, it was Killington Route 4 and West Bridgewater Route 100, and we thought at that moment it was just a really unusually heavy summer storm. The governor and I went down the next day to view the damage, and no sooner had we gotten home that Saturday night, and we started to realize the potential for some significant weather early that week, and of course, we all know what happened after that. The initial incident period with FEMA ran from July 7th to July 17th. The administration lobbied for an extension, and that was granted. So the incident period is now July 7th to July 21st. Admittedly, we had significant damage in Addison County also on August 3rd, but we're here, we'll talk about the totality of damage, but the FEMA incident period is July 7 to July 21. Just on the third page, just some facts regarding the damage. We had 900, this is just on, as far as roadway damage, this is just on the federal highway system. This is not intended to have captured anything on town networks or local roads, but 962 different damaged sites. Currently, as of this writing, 765 have been repaired. We have currently 2 state roads that are still closed and 7 state roads that I choose to say partially open. But all of that work will press into the month of November. It is tracking on time and on schedule, but what's left is just that big that it's going to take that amount of time. 832 culverts were impacted by this. So far, we've cleaned out 479. We've replaced 62. I won't read each of these. I do think that some of these are really important to note. 199 slope and slides repaired. This is just on the state highway system. We were in a meeting with FEMA and the governor probably about a month ago, and the state geologist who works for ANR made a comment, which I thought was pretty poignant. He said, this event will be the 1927 flood of slides. This is really the most landslides we've seen that we've recorded. And we were in a period well into early September where the ground was still so saturated that it didn't take much rain at all to create more problems. And so we're thankful for the better weather. So again, a lot of data here on this page, but I won't read all of that. We wanted to be sure to include some pictures so that you could really get a sense of the type of damage. Jane, if you go back one, if you didn't mind. This is so much like what we saw in Irene in Route 131. This is 106, but 131, similar to this, just losing whole sections of one lane of road. A lot of work to repair all that. And the next slide is Reading, Vermont on Route 106. And I can tell you that that looks identical to Irene. I was there for Irene. I was there a month ago. And it's everything. It's the topography, the debris, the way everything is. But it was a flashback to being on Irene 12 years before. And then we move into some pictures of rail. Well, actually, this is, again, typical of one of the slides. And for those of you from around Washington County, you saw, I think, a pretty impressive slide right down on the Beltline on Route 62. That goes way back up on the hill. The slide that occurred on Route 4 on July 7th was enormous. It went a few hundred yards back up the hill. We had to fly a drone up to get to the top of it just to see what it looked like. That's how far up it was. Truly geologically impressive, but sort of frightening as to how much came down. The next picture moves into rail. This was Ludlow. I think pretty much this picture has been seen widely around the country. Vermont Rail Systems and its contractors, along with the effort of the rail section, did a tremendous amount of work to get this up and running in a relatively short period of time. And then just some pictures of rail bridge damage right here in the Washington County area. We had a fairly close call, which isn't on here, but Amtrak passenger train in Middlebury, I think it was Tuesday night, and Vermont Rail Systems dispatch had given Amtrak an alert and said, basically, you should implement a slow order because there was heavy rain again. And they came up through and the engineers saw water over the tracks, were able to stop the train safely. Everybody got to the rear of the train, they disembarked, and when they finally were able to get off and look, we have pictures somewhere, they're not in this deck, but the engine was actually on rail, and there was, the earth had washed away underneath the ties. So not to the extent that the Ludlow picture by any means, but it was maybe 6 or 8 inches, but still, it could have been potentially disastrous. And these things popped up every time we had a rainstorm. It just, August 3rd, Middlebury, 6 inches of rain, Route 116, which you'll see pictures of. Extremely challenging times. But I think in the next picture, you'll see, again, the sort of recovery that has been accomplished, not only on Vermont's road systems and our bridges, but on rail. A tremendous amount of work. Moving to the Lamoille Valley Rail Trail, of course, the irony here couldn't be any stronger. That was the weekend that the celebration was supposed to have taken place.
And the governor had to cancel his run.
Yeah.
I know it. And
or leap over the Lamoille.
Couldn't ride her bike for the whole life.
But you should have seen the bridge in Hardwick. It would have been quite a.
It was, and
an evil.
So on the Lamoille Valley, we had 138 individual damaged sites, and frankly, making significant progress. The governor announced last week we just opened one more section. So we have, I believe it's about a 20-mile section between Wolcott and Hardwick that is left to open. We have 2 contractors that are on that project. These contractors were on the original rehabilitation project, and they're doing very well. We have 3 major damaged sites that we have to contend with. One is in the East Hardwick, Greensboro, Bend area. It's sort of right on the line. It was a complete washout. Initially, we were going to put a temporary bridge there, but it's been recommended, and we can put in culverts, which was what was there, and get that fixed, we hope, by the end of the year. We have a temporary bridge coming for the bridge that Senator Kitchell, you and I and others were at in Hardwick. And just up the road from that, a little closer to the village or to the town of Hardwick, is another 2-span iron railroad bridge that was knocked off its piers. We were going to put a temporary bridge there, but the company who manufactured some of the bridges for the railroad, for the trail, when we rehabbed the trail, had another bridge in inventory. So we are moving forward. That will be a forever fix and not a temporary. And so we are pushing as hard as we can to close the gap. And we'll have more to say about that as time allows. Again, just some pictures to show you the degree of damage. I've been out on the trail with our trail people, myself, not the entirety of it, but some of the most significantly damaged areas of it. And like anything, it's incredibly challenging because, especially damage, rehabbing the trail was one thing, but fixing some of the significant damage is really tough because accessing, we went to a place that had culverts and they were about 100 feet below the elevation of the trail. And it's about a 45-degree slope to get down there. And then, you have to deal with right-of-way to get equipment in. So it's been a challenging project, but very rewarding to see, people by the hundreds, if not thousands, on the trail every day or weekend. So good work happening there. Then we move into some of what's occurred down the road at our Route 302 complex, or as many of you refer to it, Central Garage. Central Garage was significantly impacted by the storm. And it wasn't just the Stevens branch that runs in the backyard between our property and the Berlin Mobile Home Park. But at 2 a.m. on Tuesday morning, I stood in the Mazda dealer's parking lot, used to be the Volkswagen dealer, and I had video. The mud brook comes down from up by the hospital and up by the reservoir in Berlin, Montpelier's reservoir. And it was a raging river. I had the video. It was truly stunning. And it just came down and was flooding directly across the street into our facility. A giant blue dumpster, probably weighs 500 pounds, was bobbing by like a rubber ducky in a bathtub. It ended up getting caught in our fence at Central Garage and took out several feet of the fence, but at least it stopped bobbing down the street. And the facility is currently, for the most part, shut down. The major buildings are shut down. The VTTC is shut down. The primary garage is shut down. And when I say that, I mean, we've cleaned out the muck. We've winterized what is in there for pipes so they don't freeze and create any more damage. We've winterized boilers in the main building. And we have currently fit up for a very modest cost 4-bay garage in the back of the property right along the river. That was the building that was most easily rehabilitated for our modest needs so that our mechanics could continue to work on trucks in an interim sort of emergency basis until we relocate. We're on the very front end of this conversation, and Todd Law, I've asked to really sort of marshal this because it's going to be a long process, but conventional wisdom says we do not go back on that property with all the conversations we had with the Vermonters about floodplain, building in floodplains, rebuilding in floodplains. This is not the first time this is flooded, but it's certainly among the most significant. Our losses were huge. Patrick, when he provides his piece, we'll have a few slides on some of the vehicles. Our crews worked throughout late that Friday, throughout the weekend, and removed about $1 million worth of equipment and got it up to Dill on high ground. There were a few vehicles they just could not get out in time, a small number, but it's probably a half a dozen, and we're still assessing a couple of the large trucks. We just couldn't get out because they were in various stages of disrepair. They weren't drivable. But so there's a lot of damage. All the tools owned by our employees, parts, supplies, everything. Our rough preliminary conversations, Jana and her team have been leading these conversations with risk management and the insurance company, and ultimately, of course, FEMA once all the other refunding is identified. But we're, in the neighborhood of $10 to $15 million in replacement costs for what was lost there. So, again, I think it's fair to say that our goal and our aim is to not go back there the way we were, if at all. And then the question becomes, where do we go? We're looking at property we already own because at the end of the day, that would be the least costly way to go. But so that's an initiative we'll be having a conversation about well throughout the session and get your advice and input on that as well. So there's just a few pictures here in the next slide of, this was after the water was down. And by no means do these slides really show, we had water up to desktops in the buildings. And like I say, mechanics can come to work today with tens of thousands of dollars of tools in these big boxes, and consider the first 3 to 4 feet of these boxes were completely underwater. And they had to throw all that stuff away, all their own personal tools. And then, of course, we go through the insurance process to replace them. And our employees that really suffered these losses down there have really stood tall and made the best of a tough situation. And they continue to keep working to do the job that's important for the agency, to keep these trucks and our equipment moving. But like so many Vermonters, really suffered some personal losses as well. So
where is the maintenance and repair? Is that being distributed across district garages, or are you hiring something interim? I mean, I just was wondering.
No, good question. So I mentioned we have a 4-bay garage way out in back. It's a wooden structure. We've upfitted that, put in some lighting, put in some modest heating, improved the electrical access as far as like drop lights and places to plug in tools, and completely deconned that building as far as inhabiting it. And so currently maintenance is happening there, but we have a maintenance facility in Chimney Corners. We have a maintenance facility in Rutland City. We have a maintenance facility in Lindenville.
So you're just moving it.
Right River, thank you. So we've been pushing some stuff out. We are not contracting any more work out than we typically would have to. We try to do all our work in-house. We're authorized as a warranty dealer by 2 of our large manufacturers. So we try to minimize all the outsourcing we can because it's more cost effective for us to do the work ourselves. On the highway and rail, this just gives you a quick look of the number of emergency projects. Federal Highway talks in the term of detailed damage inspection reports, or DDIRs. FEMA talks in the world of PWs, which are project worksheets. Of course, because we own railroad and because we own central garage, we become FEMA eligible in that realm. But obviously, we also are FHWA ER eligible because of all the state roads and bridges. So again, this just shows you a lot of data sets as to the amount of initial work. All this was happening immediately. We stood up our Transportation Incident Command Center at Dill. That effort really started happening over the weekend, and we were ready to go that first day. I mean, people were working Sunday, but by Monday, we were starting to deploy people. We moved people around the state of Vermont. The Northwest was the least hit. We redeployed people to the Southwest and Southeast. They lived down there for a period of time, brought their trucks and equipment. That was Ernie's area. And then Mike Booth, who's not here, in the Northeast, to some degree, his crews as well. So we really moved around to try to, lean into the effort here as best we could. On the far right, we're just showing you a snapshot of some of the degree of magnitude of individual projects. And this may come up in Bradley's presentation, but this is probably a good time to just say that, level set expectations, we are going to need to readjust the capital program. And there's just no two ways about it. And so I think I want to remind everybody that doesn't mean things are going to fall off forever. It really just means that we'll have to adjust the timing of certain projects that are currently in the capital program, because we're now going to have to insert projects that none of us expected, and we just don't have a choice. So we have to manage what's in front of us and do it in the most practical and responsible way. We're still in that process right now. So today, I don't have a lot of details to give you as to the number of projects or specific projects that, for that matter. And but we're also, we have to look at the schedule of what we put out at the moment until we figure that all out. But we'll start really wrapping our heads around that a little more deeply, probably by the first part of November. And clearly that'll be part of the 25 budget presentation that we present to you in January.
About working capital, millions of dollars have gone out. You were able to fund it as you go because contractors want to get paid.
Right. No, that's a great question. And so Federal Highway, within probably 14 days or so, it was a few days after Secretary Buttigieg was here, actually, we submitted a $10 million request for emergency funds, and that's the way Federal Highway operates. And I received a text message late one evening that had just been signed by Administrator Shaylin Bott, who was here that day with Secretary Buttigieg. And so that money came in fairly quickly. Bradley can speak to how fast the money came in, but that helps us, fund what we're doing. And then, and again, Bradley has more detail, but we have to start using funds we have that were perhaps otherwise pigeonholed until we can put them back where they were pigeonholed, because we had to have operating capital.
Were you able to get contractors?
Oh, absolutely. And that's a great point that I should make. Our industry partners were critical. I think initially, I'm looking at Ann, but I think initially we had at least 5 of our projects, or slightly more than 5 of our regular construction projects, that were damaged by the storm. We had to shut them down. And then we had other projects that we shut down so that the contractors could lead those projects and go to assist towns, or to assist us actually as well. And then we went through sort of a phased relaunch of those projects. We had to recover from the damage on those state projects that were damaged. But then as everything sort of reached an equilibrium with the towns and contractors' capabilities were such, we started bringing them back onto our projects. So we could not have recovered as quickly as we did without industry partners, and clearly the work they're still doing in some cases is really important. So, and so now we just a snapshot of. I want to make a point that any dollars you see here, we're not at the top yet. So this is really the price tag you see on rail is probably the closest thing to a final number, but it isn't the final number. But when we get to project worksheets or FEMA roll up and we get to Federal Highway, that is just where we're at now. We're not done. So, but obviously it's important to talk about where we're at today. And again, on the Federal Highway side, we did have a significant period where the emergency work we do is funded at 100%. And then there's a process that they work through based on what the projects are that follow as a result of the flooding and, the 80-20 split, or is there some difference there? And as you may have, or some of you may have heard, perhaps in a certain testimony this morning in fiscal, that obviously there's a belief by the administration that on the FEMA side, we're going to get past the point by which FEMA will go from the 80 or 75-25 split to a 90-10 split, which isn't just important for the state as an owner, but it's critically important for Vermont communities that have FEMA PA expenditures, as to whether they end up having to shoulder a 10% difference or a 25% difference. So we're not officially there yet. FEMA can't say we're there because from their perspective, they're not. But we're pretty confident we're going to get there. And they just have to work through the portfolio of projects that are already, everybody's agreeing on what's eligible, if you will, but each project worksheet has to be worked through. And then at least once enough of them are worked through to trigger, well, I think it's like 111 million.
That's what
And
we
at least,
yeah.
right. So then the word can go out, but there's still, fortunately, years of work. I mean, we just finished Tropical Storm Irene close out in May, I think it was, the very last project we had. So again, 225 sites on our active rail lines. And, you know, this damage transcended 23 towns, several counties. This storm was truly unique. I worked through Irene, and it was devastating in a very, very concentrated area. This storm was strange in so much as if you look at if you just look at Ludlow to Johnston, and then obviously Barry Montpelier, and I don't want to forget anyone in between, but, you know, the far reaches of Lamoille County, as well as southern Vermont, and just really hitting central Vermont hard. And then, of course, the impact of people, in my view, is so much more significant from this storm than Irene was. And to take nothing away from the lives lost on Irene, or the homes lost, or the businesses damaged, but when you listen to the General Roy and the governor talk of the numbers, whether it's businesses destroyed or homes that are damaged or impacted or substantially damaged, people that are actually looking for housing as we speak, this was a real different storm and much more heavily damaging to the people's side of things. So I think looking for some silver linings, only 4 state bridges were impacted in this event versus 34 in Irene. So much of that is dependent on the storm itself and the dynamics of every water course and every structure. But I'd like to think that, you know, much of that was in part because of the way things were built back after Irene. We actually saw places that did well. Perhaps the Reading 106 picture wasn't the epitome of defining that, but and the bridge was fine. It's everything went around that bridge. But a lot of the infrastructure that was built back after Irene, including the Waterbury State Office Complex, you know, the issue there was Waterbury Village. It was, you know, the complex, the buildings did not get flooded like they did in Irene. A lot of the mitigation work that occurred in the years to follow Irene down there worked. So that goes to show that this stuff can work, and it's really important that we think that way and that we do things that mitigate for future disasters. So again, a lot of data, and I don't want to read through every bit of it, but a lot of emergency work, you know, ongoing and future challenges. As I mentioned a while ago, we still have some state roads that are closed, some that are partially open. And we do, as I mentioned also, I think I got ahead of myself, but we do need to program some of our permanent repair projects from the storm into the capital program. And we'll move right to the last slide. And I really want to emphasize again, these numbers, that FEMA number is not just AOT. That FEMA number is everything we understand that's FEMA eligible, which will include towns. That's a shared number. It rolls up at Vermont Emergency Management as well.
That's just public assistance, not the.
Correct. That's not, that great point, Senator Kitchell. That does not include individual assistance. I believe General Roy said today the individual assistance number was 19 million already at this point, but this is just public assistance. These are damages. These are not dollars that have been paid out yet. These are just eligible damages. And then 130 million on the FHWA side. And again, those numbers have not all been fully vetted and agreed, and that's the process. But this is what we are tracking for monetary impacts, but we're not done yet. So.
Thank you. Were you coming to, I had a question about that previous slide, maybe.
About the what slide?
About the previous slide, just about the ongoing and future challenges. I just wanted to, I know, while you don't have all of the final numbers or assessments, were any of the projects that were in the white book, were they included in some of the damage? Are you been able to do some preliminary analysis? I know it's not final, but do you have a sense of, are any of those projects actually able to be covered through some of the, the FEMA relief?
Like the Route 2, would that would have been under the limited scheme?
So the answer is emergency work we would have undertaken would be covered. So any emergency work that occurred, in official's point on US 2, would be covered. And Ann can pipe in, but that project in particular was not significantly impacted as far as delays. I mean, it was clearly impacted. I traveled that route a few times during the storm and in the aftermath of the storm, but it is not set back tremendously, overall in the grand scheme of things from what the project would have already impacted commuters. But it was significantly impacted. It was closed for probably 48 hours altogether. A lot of soil washed away, had to be replaced. And then, of course, it became a really rough, rocky road for a while because everything that, it just kept raining. So everything that was put back just would wash away the next day. And, and that's another point about this storm, or frankly, a series of storms. Irene happened on a Sunday afternoon, and within 12 hours, it was gone. Now, tremendous damage, tragic loss of life, but it was gone. And we had a really nice week until the following weekend when it was Labor Day. Then there was some scares again, but this just kept happening. It just kept happening and happening and happening. And while we did not have some of the deluge of rain that we had in the first 48 hours or maybe 60 hours of this event, we had some incredible storms. August 3rd, as I said, Middlebury, 6 inches of rain. Blew out 116, blew out 2 places in 125 in Ripton, one in Hancock, Route 25. I mean, just here we go again. It was like July 11th all over again. And
this is going to become, this might become our new normal. I mean, that we're going to be in more frequency since Irene to these series of storms. So I'm with the future challenges. That's also what you're describing, Secretary, is like a future challenge. So I'm imagining that will be part of the thinking. The questions about do we rebuild on the same, whether from the central garage issue to place. So that's going to be an enormous task for your team. But in you're thinking, when do we start to see some of that? Do you think we'll see some of that before the start of the session? Some of your assessments of, frankly, the budget, the FY24 budget and what the impacts are going to be, or are you anticipating that'll be part of the?
Well, I mean, impacts of the 24 budget will feed how we build the 25 budget, obviously, as every year does. And Bradley we have not compared notes, so okay. I'm not sure exactly what I'll learn with his presentation is at the same time as you, but yes, I think the answer is yes, it will be necessary. A couple things I just want to note that on Sunday before everything started in earnest, so this would have been the 9th of July, I was contacted by Marie-Therese Dominguez, the Commissioner of New York DOT, separately, and Bill Cass, the Commissioner of New Hampshire DOT, and they both wanted us to know that anything Vermont needed. And we said, same goes for us. We didn't realize, of course, to the degree we were going to get hit. New York State, so Route 116 at Dow Pond requires a significant, interesting and unusual design box culvert, 125 feet long. And it would have taken a fair amount of time to have the entire thing fabricated, and it comes from a company in New York State. I was told by some of our V-Trans employees they thought New York DOT had some of this in stock. So I called Marie-Therese and I asked, and she called me back that afternoon, and they gave us what they had, and we trucked it to Vermont. And the kind of relationships we have, it was all on an oral agreement. She just said, you agree to replace it in kind when you can? And I said, yes, we do. And that was that. So tremendous working relationships. And that got us more than half of what we needed for material, and we're having the rest of it fabricated. And then, of course, we have to fabricate what they gave us to give back. And the state of Maine also gave us an unusually large round culvert that expedited some work. So again, just, everybody works together. And it's important, I think, to say that, because we don't always, with everything going on, we don't always hear that.
Great to hear.
So that sort of breezes through the formal presentation, and I know there's many others to come.
And we could spend a lot of time on this, and I appreciate that you're able to go into this and do it pretty quickly. But I wanted to make sure that we had time for some additional questions. People have been asking along the way, but are there other questions for the secretary?
So I just have one. When I look at the FEMA versus the federal highway, talk to me about the match. Match required, I know, on FEMA, and that we're working on, or maybe getting to the 90-10. And I'm sorry, I don't recall. What is the federal highway? Is that the variety of 80-20 something, or is that?
Bradley, if you don't mind, I'll defer to CFO.
For the record, Bradley Remember, CFO of the Agency of Transportation. So there is a distinction between the FHWA emergency response that is paid out at 100%.
Okay.
We like that.
There we go. That's
And then
nice.
there's, that goes up to work that can be done within 270 days from the day of the emergency. And then there's a permanent work aspect to the program as well, and that flows at 80-20 or 90-10.
Excuse my back, I was just taking notes.
Yeah, of course.
So of the 130, and then I'll stop talking, do we know? So I'm assuming then that a portion of that is at the 100%, and then there'll be something else at the 80-20, depending on what's done. Okay.
Yeah. Primarily, we're still determining the exact dollar amounts of the two buckets, but FHWA has been really collaborate with, allowing us to get as much of the 100% we can, but then there's certain, bridge projects that take multiple years, and we're still determining. But it'll primarily be split up in that way. Projects that take multiple years to actually do properly, those will come at the rate of state match.
Just like to get just a little bit of a sense of when the dollars that's going to be needed for the match part.
So I do have a question about how the money's flowing. Obviously, we've spent a lot. For example, Route 15 in Hardwick, that was a major loss into the Lamoille. And obviously, I don't know what the cost was to get that road back to 2 lanes. Would that 100% money flow immediately? What is the mechanism by which you're getting that reimbursement from the feds? Are we advancing some of it out of just your appropriation and then money flowing in, or it's not in the form of a grant?
It is not in the form of a grant.
Because you already have that, debt ID and stuff.
Yeah, so from an accounting perspective, we have FHWA appropriations, and we are also able, through the excess receipt process,
Right.
to increase spending authority in anticipation of receipts.
Was there a long delay before those federal funds started flowing to actually, I'm sure JPC card wanted to get paid, for example.
So we get a bill, we pay it. We pay it immediately. And so at this outset of the flood, we made sure that we had the appropriate spending authority, particularly in the rail section and the highways programs. There's more wiggle room in the amount of federal dollars that are available. And so we use the excess receipt process to gather the spending authority needed to pay our bills. And then in anticipation of those receipts. And then as the secretary said, from the FHWA side of things, we received $10 million in cash side about a month following all of the emergency. And then after that, it just flows through our normal billing process. So we incur our receivable, and then as we're able to bill it through working with FHWA.
Then you do the federal draw.
Yep.
Just on follow-up there, no,
Assessment on the potential shutdown in the federal impact on.
I have that. I mean, no, you just hot off the press. So this is as of yesterday. Because of advanced appropriations in 2JA, all FHWA, all Federal Transit Administration, all National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, and all Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration staff will remain on board during a shutdown, and those programs continue.
Without pay?
No, they're already appropriated through 2JA, so that's not affected. What is affected will be FRA and FAA. Each of those government agencies will see out of 38% immediate furlough of employees. So FRA would not continue any of its core functions, no contracts, no further contracts, no purchase orders, or no obligations would occur, but grants that we've already received wouldn't be impacted. And the same with FAA. And my understanding, this is not control tower FAA people. These are backroom
I was gonna say, just for people who are listening, FFA.
I'm sorry,
That's Federal Rail.
Federal Rail Administration and the Federal Aviation Administration. Thank you. So, but both of those programs too, as far as the agency goes, they are grant funders. And so we're constantly, you know, as you know, through our budgets, that's how those are funded. So we have received grants already. What might be real is decisions on grants that we already have in the queue might potentially be impacted as to when we get an answer. And that could translate into some sort of impacts on a project. But I think that that's only if there's a shutdown, if there is. I think that's only if it goes very
I
long.
don't believe they'll shut down. They always go right to the end.
So the biggest bulk of our business would continue unimpeded with respect to, you know, highways and bridges and the highway safety program in transit providers.
Thank you. I'm with you, Senator. I don't believe, but you know, that's when it happens.
And just if
I
I could
appreciate
join,
your optimism. We've got a segment there that would close it down.
and if I just go back to the comment earlier about, I think to your point, Representative Lamford, you asked about the PA number not including individual assistance. General Roy reported this morning at the press conference that individual assistance currently is $19.8 million that has been paid out. That's not in that number.
Right, that's right. It's not that number.
So that concludes the prepared.
Yeah, any further questions?
Good job.
This is great. Thank you. Thank you so much. And it's kind of a nice segue to, I think, my side, which is impact of flooding in Bradley. Come on up. I feel like I'm on The Price is Right. Come on up, yeah. So,
Oh, good afternoon.
good afternoon. Good to see you, Bradley.
Thanks for having me again. For the record, Bradley Cooperberger, Agency Transportation CFO. I didn't prepare any slides or anything of that nature. We started having some of the conversations I was anticipating having regarding process of funding, the paying of bills, and keeping everything flowing to that effect. One of the agenda items you asked for, and it did come up a bit in the Secretary's presentation, is related to what's referred to as the 10G report or the delayed projects report. And So I have to say we are still evaluating all of the project impacts to the capital program as budgeted. As of yet, we have not delayed anything within the fiscal 24 capital program. There was a question about, I think Senator Kitchell, you asked, to what extent were or maybe it was Representative Lanfear, to what extent was the emergency flood response projects intersect with the capital program? And upon full, pretty good evaluation at this point, it is a shockingly limited scope of projects that were, or sites that were impacted by the flood and projects we had anticipated.
They were not in the white book, I think that's my question, yeah.
Very, very few.
If we have these savings.
And so we have been working through with our federal partners on the process of identifying sites, reviewing scopes of work, preparing the documentation necessary for that. And then on the FHWA side, those get signed off on a thing called a DDIR. And on the FEMA side, it's a project worksheet, and come to sort of like a overview general agreement as to terms of scope, and then the work happens. We receive the bills, and it narrows and narrows and narrows until we have a precise amount. And we, I don't have the specific details about how that would impact our FY24 or 25 funding as of yet, but as the Secretary alluded to, it will certainly be part of the budget presentations that we come back to you with in January.
Go ahead, yes.
Well, it makes me think of Alex Portaluppi. I bet he's glad he's retired.
His name has come up a few times, especially with my team in the finance.
My question is sort of related to the earlier one regarding projects and the extent to which we could get reimbursement because there was damage. On the other hand, where the damage did occur, were any of those sites in fact anticipated at some point in need? Because there's more than one way to get the benefit of these additional dollars. So I guess the question was, out of all the different areas where there were damages, maybe there is an intersection between what would be proposed as projects for the future that can get funded as a result of the flood dollars.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Senator Kitchell. It's when you look at just the FY24 or in the capital program, the proposed FY25 and so on, there was not a great intersection of those two areas. But of course, if you look at the transportation system as a whole, this could benefit the future capital asset needs because they've jumped the line in a way in our.
Just got advanced as a result of Mother Nature.
FHWA has been extremely generous in that we were working with them, with a representative in the room almost from day one of the flood response. And they've been, I think at the time more allowing and making things more eligible than we had in our minds anticipated. And so from that perspective, I think we're going to do pretty well from an asset perspective in the long term.
If I may add to that question, Senator Kitchell, we're going to get a new bridge. I think it's Route 125 in Berkshire. We're going to get two bridges on Route 110, one just north of Chelsea and one in Washington. We're going to get a new bridge. I had it in my mind while Bradley was speaking. There's a fourth just on the highway system. So, those are bridges that are going to be they're going to have permanent fixes. And 125 in Hancock, I'm sorry, yes, 125 in Hancock. So I have the wrong number, I think first year's 113. Route 125 in Hancock, that's brand new box culvert that went in. So those are projects that will not now have to happen for many, many years because they had to be built, or in the case of Route 110 and Route 113 in Berkshire, those are temporary at the moment, but they will be new bridges, and those are exactly to your point.
The other part about Irene is that so much of the damage was in the White River Valley area and Bethel. I mean, down through there, I've got tremendous blowouts of the roads. And of course, Vermont is all hill or valley. So it seemed to be different. Connecticut River, there was nothing there, but at Lamoille and Winooski, that tremendous damage. So it's very interesting how some of those areas, I don't know, is it because it just didn't hit there, or did what we do to rebuild actually was much more resilient? Because that was all part of the design from the get-go. So I was just wondering if, in fact, because there was an article, Brandon, for example, suffered a lot of damage, and then they were featuring the box culvert that they felt was actually instrumental in preventing flooding again in Brandon. So I was wondering if there would have been damage from what we've done actually. Hopefully that's your appointment.
I think the answer is it's a bit of both. I mean, if you look at Route 107, from Tozier's Restaurant down to Gaysville and on to 100, I believe I heard that, but the White River rose 21 feet during Irene. That did not happen to that degree in this storm. So I think some of it is how the roads were built back, banks were armored differently, and culverts were upsized, and bridges were, built differently. It also is because the storm was different. Right.
So I imagine that in the coming session, I mean, that's what I'm interested in hearing too, I think, was just like, what are we doing right? What do we need to change? And I think we're, with regard to the projects in the White Book, what does get, like, what doesn't get done that, and with the understanding that, of course, that has to happen, but, what has kind of skipped the line. I have another question, just about, back at the end of July, I'm just thinking about how you're managing the transportation budget. I'm imagining we're going to hear it's going to be very tight, and we also got news at the end of July about the revised revenue forecast. And with primarily from the lower receipts and the lower projections of receipts with the gas tax. So that's essentially like another 2.9 million. It was softened by the DMV fee bill that we passed this session. So it's not as significant as it would have been. But do you want to just talk about kind of the fiscal picture from where you're seeing today and just how FY24 is looking and how you're thinking about managing that in the context, and now the flood, right? So it's a lot to manage, but I'd just be interested to hear how you're thinking through some of the stuff.
Certainly. So if we look at the flood impacts to our transportation fund liabilities, in addition to the other economic realities that occurred at, our fiscal 23 receipts and our projections for fiscal 24. I think what we've done is you can essentially isolate the transportation fund impacts to two areas. The largest being rail, because as we mentioned, the FEMA PA response, which is much of the work that has already occurred in response to the flooding in fixing the rail sites, that comes with a 10% state match right off the bat, right? So that is an area where we have a focus for 24. Also, we have the emergency response on the highway side. That is less of a state fund draw in that up until, I think, April or May of next year, we have 100% state fund or federal fund coverage for those types of projects. So really the state fund impact on the highway side is going to be in the future.
And I should have qualified, it's really, we're talking about state funds is what I'm,
Yeah.
So like
state funds.
maintenance, and then the maintenance budgets, I imagine it's the other.
And then from an accounting perspective, what you'll see, I believe, the General Assembly or some committees receive a report of the excess receipts. And so you'll see excess receipts related to this emergency response of 45 million for rail. That's in a FEMA code. And then to date, about 25 million we've processed in excess receipts for, and we've run everything through the maintenance appropriation. So we're using that as a way to limit all of the accounting transfers, is to kind of flow everything through the maintenance appropriation. And but from a state fund impact, we're held pretty much harmless in terms of the budget that you're used to seeing.
For you, Ed.
Sure, thank you. I just want to make sure that I'm understanding, which I think I do, the excess receipts is like carried forward, is that which?
No.
No,
It's
it's coming in from the Fed, it's like,
But in addition to.
Right, it happens a lot in human services as well.
Right.
Where the federal dollars are higher, but you have authority to accept them because it's existing an account.
so 45 million for the rail and 25 for highway
To date, yep.
to date.
And I know July revenues, it was really squirrely because the tax department was flooded and receipts weren't processed. So, and then August sort of equalized. So right now we're so early in the fiscal year, seeing how that will work. But absolutely, the revenues from the fees did obviously close the gap in building this year's plan. So, but I don't know, we'll have to watch the revenues as a relative to forecast. But July was, you looked at it and you said, oh, wow, we're not doing well. But then you discovered it was because payments weren't being processed until August.
Yeah, I think we'll have a much clearer picture in for the January forecast than we had in July.
Although the automotive strike may have an impact on purchase and use. I mean,
Yeah,
you know, so.
there's a lot in play. Oh, okay. Any other questions right now? Well, great. Well, Bradley, thank you. And we look, so from what I understand is there's a lot that you're going to be working on. So this is really going to come back to us not before the start of the session, yet through the BAA and through the FY25 budget process. But specifically, I'm asking about transportation.
That's right.
Transportation budget. Great. Thank you so much. Well, this is great, and I think we're running almost close to on time, which is terrific. So, so I think we wanted to invite Patrick Murphy up to give us a little bit of an update on some of the vehicle incentive programs and good to see you, Patrick.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
Thank you. For the record, Patrick Murphy, work as a Sustainability Innovations Project Manager at the Agency of Transportation. So I'm going to run this is is sort of the minor aspect of all the agency's response efforts. So I'll run through these slides and.
We might have some questions. Yeah, this is great. It's good to hear what you've.
So we don't still have a good understanding of the full kind of scope of all the vehicles damaged. We understand, based on the number of households that have been damaged, of course, it's got to be quite significant. We did reach out to FEMA to better understand the scope of this, and we got some data about who has to date reported damage to their vehicles. Most, I think, are probably covered by comprehensive insurance, and so that is the kind of first place to go when looking to replace vehicles. But if that isn't the case, if there isn't comprehensive insurance, there are programs through the Small Business Administration, and you first have to apply to those before then, and be denied before then moving on to some of the assistance that's provided through FEMA, which provides up to $10,000 to repair or replace a vehicle. So we also reached out to FEMA to ensure that whatever we devised as flood response would not jeopardize those potential dollars going to people that had been impacted, and be able to move forward with something. The goal, of course, was to provide as much assistance as possible to as many people as possible. And thanks to the efforts of you all with past legislative session, we had some flexibility in the administration of our programs and some room to work with to provide a little bit extra support so that people who were faced with the decision to make to purchase a different vehicle would be able to make hopefully a better decision for climate reasons and try and avoid all this kind of these kinds of disasters in the first place. We've got a lot of work to do there. So the small changes that we made to the incentive program for new plug-in electric vehicles is just going up to that full $6,000 cap. So for people with the lowest income, they'd be able to get an additional $1,000 if they traded in a vehicle, and that's regardless of whether they qualified for that Replace Your Ride program. So they would still be able to get that additional support. For the for the Mileage Smart program, the statute allows up to $5,000. Administratively, we put a cap on that of 25% of the purchase price. But in the case of a vehicle that had been impacted by the flood, again, regardless of whether it would qualify for the Replace Your Ride program, we said we'll automatically extend that $5,000 to folks. So as an example, if you have a $16,000 vehicle, under the existing guidelines, it'd be capped at a $4,000 incentive. If your vehicle had been impacted by the flood, you'd be able to get up to that full $5,000. And then lastly, for the Replace Your Ride program, it allows for up to $5,000 to replace a vehicle that's 10 years or older. And we have drivability requirements as part of the guidelines so that the vehicle you're replacing is not just, some old Chevy Corvair in the backyard that's never been on the road for, decades, but is actually that's
We're all looking to the garage.
I want to pick up on that. I'd be careful.
That Corvair's long gone.
So we want to make sure that the vehicle that's being replaced is actually replacing greenhouse gas emissions. And so that's why those guidelines are in place. But in this case, we waived those so that a vehicle that had been totaled in the flood would not have to start of its own ignition, and it would not have to drive forwards and backwards in the ways that we've laid out.
Going back to the new vehicles, are lease vehicles also covered?
Yes.
I thought so. I just wanted to confirm my memory.
Yep. Leased vehicles and the guidelines we put there is a minimum of 24 months for the lease terms.
24 months. Okay.
How are we doing on charging stations? I know it's a different subject. Are we?
Sure.
We're on schedule putting them in?
So,
I could ask.
yeah, FHWA has, the Federal Highway Administration has certainly provided a number of hoops for the agency to go through, but we have passed through sort of one of the last hoops, which was to get our contracting method approved. And so we expect to have a lot of money out the door being released by the end of this year.
So we haven't installed any this summer?
We are still, as part of earlier funding through VW settlement funds and through state capital funds, we're still getting new stations installed under an agreement with DHCD, the Housing Community Development. But none of the new federal funding has yet gone out the door.
One of the questions I always ask, how the charging stations come before I buy one, because.
And so one of the things that we did look at is what was impacted by this flood. You have stations right outside that were definitely impacted.
Oh, yeah.
And so there will be some funding potentially available through the federal government through a competitive grant that closes in November, and we'll be applying to be able to repair and replace existing stations that are offline.
Thank you.
Sure.
But there were some pretty significant details that were announced in the spring about the EV, like the requirements that were there was a high bar set for some of those things, right? That we were not totally anticipating, like where the components of them are made and things like that, similar to some of the other federal legislation.
Yeah, there are Buy America requirements that certainly make things challenging. But we do expect to have a request for qualifications and then RFPs out before the end of the year.
Okay, great. And in that fund, just like in the previous slide, there's 8.4 million remaining out of the 15 million.
Yeah, this is to give you context of where all the different programs are.
Yep. Thank you.
Mine Smart was where most people had applied to, and it makes sense. It's the most kind of affordable path for people that are replacing their vehicles that didn't expect to. So we did have nearly 20 applications, and 11 of those have since been approved.
20 flood related?
Yes.
Okay. I was just wondering what the take up had been relative to the.
Yeah.
So this number is the flood related specific.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. And so and below is how many total applications, regardless of whether they're flood related or not, during that same period. So 161 applications and nearly 20 of those were flood related. So that's
161
On the bottom.
yes.
Okay.
So the replace your ride aspect of it was a little bit trickier because there is that 10-year requirement for vehicles. So you could have an 8-year vehicle that was flooded and damaged that wouldn't then qualify. Under the other programs, we were able to provide some additional incentives, but that may be something that we come to the legislature to look at for more flexibility in circumstances like these.
Great.
So that's the gist of it. If you have any questions, happy to.
I just want to say, I appreciate the work that you did to make sure that, Vermonters impacted by the flood could have greater access, really getting the word out and, there might be more, but I know that individuals losing your car is a huge thing. And so if we can provide some support for people, I think it was a pretty creative way to do that. So
we are keeping it open until the end of the year, understanding that plenty of people, I'm sure, were focused on replacing other items and kind of maybe didn't have the resources at that time to do so. So we are keeping track of this through the end of the year.
Any questions from the committee?
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for coming and sharing that update. So I'm just going to make a little technical shift. I think Michelle Howard is joined us remotely, and we'll get the presentation down so we can see Michelle.
Thank you.
Great. So we're moving on to our agenda item of the Franklin County Airport related property transaction. So welcome, Michelle. Thanks for joining us from away.
Thank you for allowing me to join from away. And I appreciate the opportunity to address the committee. For the record, my name is Michelle Boomhauer, and I'm the Division Director for Policy Planning and Intermodal Development for the agency. That includes our rail, aviation, and public transit assets. And I'll have Jana bring up the slide presentation.
Thanks. Great, so we can see the presentation. Ooh, and you, we can see you, Michelle, too. So
I have two of these, but
Yeah, the one with Joe's on.
one's
Name.
Franklin and one's Caledonia.
Yes.
Caledonia.
oh, maybe I.
Yeah, Franklin, this is.
No, I have Go Fish. I have two Caledonia. I mean, probably because I represent Caledonia District, yeah.
You're gonna get a big airport at your place.
Yeah.
Here we go. I have there's an extra one.
Okay, maybe you got two of one and
Maybe somebody else got two of one. So, all right, we're sorted though now. Sorry for that.
Okay. Terrific. Jana, you can go to the first slide, please. So in your package, what I wanted to first do was include some background related to the airport project, since some of you are more familiar with it than others. So we have improvements at the Franklin County Airport, which are being carried out in two phases. And they've been in the capital program, these two phases of the project, and there's many elements of the project. And so I included excerpts from the capital program later in my presentation, just to sort of help frame the complexity of this project. So the elements of this project have been in the capital program for the past 5 years, starting in FY20. And it includes rehabilitation and expansion and various associated projects under several project numbers, as I mentioned. Phase 1 is the part of the project that occurred principally this summer. There were some lead up elements to this phase, including some fence work we did a few years ago. But this summer, we did the rehabilitation and the widening, a 15-foot widening of the existing runway. The FAA required us to do the widening to bring it up to federal specifications. And this phase 1 was $6.9 million, and it was funded over a multi-year FAA annual funding that we receive, as well as state funding that would be appropriated in the capital bill. Phase 2 includes the runway taxiway expansion project. And this project included two principal funding streams. One was a $2 million earmark that was secured by Senator Leahy, and the other is discretionary FAA funding for $3.8 million, which is the total. So a little, almost $6 million for the second phase of the project as well. And complementing this project is a work that the town of Highgate is doing on a sewer water line extension that runs up Route 78 from near the interstate area all the way to Airport Road, where you access the airport. And then it runs down Airport Road to the terminal building. And this is about a $3 million project total. It's the first phase of their water sewer line extension. They expect at some point to bring that extension all the way up to the village of Highgate. So the town in their $3 million project has amassed $2 million in funding from various sources. And then the General Assembly, through the governor's recommend, has included $1 million towards that project, which essentially assured that we would have the coverage out to the airport terminal to basically connect future economic development projects that will be occurring associated with the airport. And I just would mention that I can't see any hands, so please just jump in if you have a question.
I don't see any yet. Yeah, none yet.
Thank you.
Well, oh, wait a second. There's one from Representative.
Given the opportunity, I shall not waste it. I'm seeing here the $2 million congressionally directed. Did that just come in, or was that something from a while ago?
That I want to say was, and Bradley might be able to help me here. I want to say that was 3 years ago, maybe 2. It was a more recent earmark, obviously during Senator Leahy's tenure.
Thank you.
Yeah. So here we are again, talking about the various elements. As I mentioned in the capital program, there are a number of PIN numbers. So we had an environmental assessment for the project. We had the southern fence relocation and expansion. We had clearing of trees at the northern end of the airport. The runway reconstruction I mentioned with the widening, and there was also lighting and power vault work that occurred in phase 1. And that all actually just got the lighting and the power vault work and the electronics all were recently tested, and I believe everything has passed or is about to be signed off by FAA, but the airport has certainly been open for a while since we finished this phase. Phase 2 included design, permitting, and mitigation for elements that required like wetlands mitigation, that sort of thing. There was also taxiway improvements, tree clearing again, and various elements of the field, the wind cone and foundation of that area, segmented circle were all replaced. And then parallel to the apron, we had a taxiway A phase C that was completed. So almost $13 million worth of investments. And I would mention here that the easements that we require for temporary construction easements, avigation easements, and I think, Janie, you can go to the next slide. They all, we'll talk about the easements here. They all were embedded in the section of the capital program amongst these various PIN numbers under the right-of-way or ROW category. And those elements ranged from 13,000 in FY21. There were actually 2 records in 21, all the way between 450,000 at the very outset in 20, and then most recently in 2024, 201,000. So I don't have a list of every single easement that was required, but the bigger one, and the one I think which is the focus of this discussion, is the air navigation easements, which we typically try to acquire these, which are areas outside of the construction of the project, but whereby, and maybe you could just take the slide down for a second, Jana, and stop the presentation. I just want to, I should have put a picture in about this, but I think many of you have heard about it. But so you come to the end of the runway and you have to sort of fly up over the trees that are at the end of the runway. And the area between the ground and the tops of those trees has to be no more than a certain height so that the airplane doesn't like hit the trees as it's making its trajectory either up off the airfield or coming down on the landing. And so those areas are the avigation easement areas where we're required to keep trees trimmed to certain heights or cut altogether. We can't have other obstructions such as antennas or houses or buildings, anything in that flight path has to be of a certain height or not existing there. And we've often been very successful in most cases in being able to make an arrangement with the abutting landowner if we don't own that navigation easement area to purchase the rights so that we can go in there and manage the cutting of the trees and ensure that the landowner doesn't place anything that would obstruct the aircraft's path in the easement area. And so that's what we're talking about when we talk about the navigation easements. And Jana, you can put the slideshow back up. And you can go to the next slide. Thanks. So securing the easements and securing all of the permitting required for the project, which includes the control of the property, the final signed off permitting, all the design work, the bidding of the project, all this has to be in place before the FAA will allow us to apply for a grant application. So it's a very different system than federal highway, whereby you're doing the project in phases and in a federal highway project. And, once you complete, they'll fund you for the first half of it, which is, all of these elements, design, permitting, making sure you have your right of way in place. And then, they'll fund you for the second half to do the actual construction. FAA requires that we control all of these elements, including the easements, in advance of applying for the federal funding. They sort of place money in their capital program, anticipating that we are going to be applying for that funding because we have constant conversations with them about the improvement program for our capital program with the FAA. So in this case, our application was due on July 15th of this year. We've been working on this project for the past, year and a half, I would say, in terms of from the beginning of the design cycle and working out the permitting, actually probably longer when you think about the 5-year scheme of the 2 phases. But we did spend months negotiating with the landowner who had the area where the navigation easements were required to be controlled. And the landowner rejected our offer of an appraisal-based easement of $224,000, which is the value our appraiser came up with. And their counteroffer was $775,000. And understanding that we would be paying $775,000 just for the easement, we didn't think that was an appropriate offer. And so we initiated condemnation proceedings with Franklin County Court. And the scheduling of the condemnation hearings exceeded the timeframe available to meet the grant application deadline. So as we are required to, we continue to work to negotiate a settlement agreement with the landowner to no avail. And and then moved on to consideration of purchasing the property. And Janie, you can go to the next slide. So with that, the landowner was willing to consider a purchase offer for the entire area. They controlled 138 acres of property, which is adjacent to the airport and has access on Route 78, as well as on Airport Road, and also on the road that goes to the high school. The landowner, our appraisal was $2.83 million. The landowner's price was set at $3.3 million. We indicated we wouldn't pay above the appraised value. And after extensive negotiations, an agreement was reached and the property was purchased at the appraised value. And the funds used were within the agency's FY24 capital program. So this property is envisioned at the scale of it to have both aviation and non-aviation uses. And we do intend to subdivide the property to retain the area required for the aviation navigation easements, as well as areas where we expect aviation economic development will be able to be initiated. And then the balance would be available for other uses after the subdivision. We are also continuing to work with the FAA on a potential for reimbursement of a portion of the cost for the property directly related to the functional use for aviation. And if we were able to come to a negotiation with them, they would require us to apply for a grant. I think the next few slides are simply the excerpts from the capital program. Jana, maybe you can this is the authority to purchase. So in terms of what we relied upon as our authority to purchase the property, because it was a value of more than 500,000, was that if the General Assembly has approved a specific project described in the annual transportation program, and the scope of the project includes acquisition or transfer of property, our interpretation was that given the fact that the right-of-way has been noted for the past 5 years in the capital program, and the project has also been approved over these 5 years for the multiple activities within the 2 phases of the project, that we were within our authority under statute to advance this purchase. And I think the next slide is the one that starts to show the capital program elements. And you'll see I did 23 and 24 as the most 2 recently recognized, but you'll see the top line of 23 has navigation easements, and you'll also see it on 24. The bottom line has navigation easements, and if you go back through the other years, you'll see other references to easements. As I mentioned, there's the ones that are the subject of this discussion, and there were others that were required to be addressed as well. So Jana, you can take the slides down, and Secretary Flynn, I didn't know if you wanted to add any specific points to the presentation right now before we get into questions.
Sure, thank you, Michelle. If I may, I think it's important to emphasize that we were running out of clock. We had a project that everyone supported through the legislative approvals. We have a project that has tremendous opportunity. And we had a deadline with FAA. We would have either had to have successfully concluded an affordable easement for navigation or whatever else we could do. So we didn't venture into this with the idea of challenging or debating, if you will, the language that we latched onto, which we believe supported our ability to do it. We saw it as the only way to accomplish what had to be done. And to Michelle's point, much of this property is tremendously important to the future of the airport beyond just the extension of the runway. But a sizable piece of this, which is the piece we're moving to at least subdivide out of the parcels. There's 4 parcels altogether that combine everything we bought, is available for further conversation. It's not all considered part of the airport. We don't want it all to be considered part of the airport because we don't want it all to be under the influence, control, or be dictated in part by our federal funder as to what we might or might not do with that other piece, which is why we're moving to subdivide part of it. So again, I made a decision based on everything we had in front of us as options. We did not want to cancel the project. If we didn't have a project moving forward, we would have lost the Leahy earmark, I'm told, by March of 2024. So there's $2 million. Obviously, the governor and legislature, the governor put in the ASREC and the legislature approved $1 million for the water line. A lot of that is predicated on expansion at the airport and what that can bring in the way of economic development. So again, we were, and not only was this all happening in fever pitch tempo the week of July 4th, which was really tough to get anybody to want to negotiate anything. Then the deadline was the week after the floods started. And, you know, we really just didn't have many other great options. And this was the option that allowed the project to be submitted. And now it's up to FAA. We feel fairly confident, as Michelle said, they look at everything in the region and they tell you to submit. And that's how this program is always funded and has been. So here we are. We own 138 acres of property. And again, if we had the map, if you picture sort of a horseshoe, but with one leg of the horseshoe somewhat shorter than the other, the long leg abuts the property of Missisquoi Valley High School, and it goes all the way to Route 78. And then it runs all along Route 78 to Airport Road, as Michelle indicated. And then it runs up Airport Road for 3 lots, which go up beyond or about to cross the street from where the Franklin County Field Days at the moment resides. So you can see the value of those pieces to airport operations. And I would add to that as well, we've worked, as I'm sure many of you have seen, various perhaps news reports, but we've worked and continue to work real close with both DEC on stormwater issues and with Fish and Wildlife on endangered species habitat. But as it relates to further easement needs, at this point, one of the likely mitigation activities we are being asked or will be asked to undertake would be the planting of certain types of shrubs that the species likes. That then would have required, yet again, an easement. So at the price of the easement, it just started to seem untenable, and making an offer to purchase the land was a decision we made to see if there was interest, and there was. And as Michelle said, we held firm that we wouldn't pay more than at least the appraised value as per our appraisal. So that's what we did. And we appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about it.
Great. Well, I appreciate Michelle and Secretary coming in, and this is, appreciate the history and the background and can appreciate the timeline. I think there are a couple of questions that the committee has. I saw Representative Langford and then Senator Kitchell. Did I possibly get, depending on, and I have a couple too, so go ahead.
I'm not as up to speed on the projects, but I'm somewhat familiar with the goings on. I've just got a question about, because it's always hard when we're looking for money, where did the $2 million come from?
I asked Bradley if we could do it. Bradley said, yes, we can.
It's a trade-off always. It didn't fall from the sky.
Right.
Yeah, so we had some available funds at the end of the year that do a budget surplus from our winter maintenance activities that we have available.
It would be net, because you already had money in there for the easement, so this was more, but you had assumed some cost. So this is the balance of the
balance of the cost, and we had some surplus funds at that point if it's possible.
We fought hard for that Green Mountain Transit money from that same place, so, last year, so good that.
So that wasn't impacted, right? That went out.
I don't think so. I don't think so.
Still
No, we made
access.
that, yeah. And it was.
Well, it's always good to know. I always like to know where it came from.
Well, the chair, you have your questions.
Sure, I just, I think, and I appreciate, I really do, the legislature approved the various expansions on this. So I think it's fair to say that the General Assembly supports this, what's going on in the Franklin County Airport. I think what caught, I'll just say me off guard was, because this came up in our committee last year when there was a purchase made for $499,000 for a garage, right? And so I think there was conversation in our committee, in the House Transportation Committee. And so so when this came up again, it just struck me. And it's interesting because I think we had maybe I highlighted different part of that same statute as being the trigger. So, and I just want to say I appreciate the time crunch and a real estate deal. I mean, that will impact, and a grant deadline. And I think in this case, it looks to me that in a perfect world, if the timeline had been broader, that JTAC would have been approached, proposal. So, and honestly, I think that's what we're trying to sort out here today. So I just want to kind of put that on the record that's, the easements are not quite the same in scope as a purchase. I think a $2.8 million land purchase is different than a $235,000 or $300,000 easement. So and I don't want to, be splitting hairs here, but I think it is an opportunity for us to figure out how to, moving forward, working together and stuff so that we have things clarified a little bit better. So I think I'll pause there and I see Senator Kitchell.
Well, I do want to say that certainly Michelle called, I think many of us, and explained the circumstances and we were understanding. I think what seems to be the issue here is what's in the white book, an easement versus outright acquisition of property. And the language talks about if the plan has specifically the project includes acquisition or transfer of property, which is different than easement. So I don't think there's any dispute that you were under the gun. You had to seize the moment. You had the deadline of that the FAA had. You had the earmark, and you made a pragmatic decision. I think maybe the issue is exact alignment with the statutory language, and to avoid any controversy or disagreement or whatever in the future that might arise. I think it would be prudent for us, actually, as JTAC, to exercise our authority and specifically approve the action and the purchase that has been undertaken for all the reasons and that you've laid out, and toward that end, simply to bring closure and certainty. And there's no dispute here that that what you did was consistent with the legislative desire to move this project forward. I would make the motion that we approve the purchase of this property as it's consistent with 5 VSEA. I got to put my glasses on, 204B requirements, and then that puts us on record as giving our stamp of approval for this so that there's no question, and that would be my motion.
Second by Senator Cummings and Representative Lanford.
Yeah, we're on a dead tie.
Great. Yeah. So
I was thinking Senate House.
So I'll say Rep. Lanford because I heard her first. She's sitting closer. So, any more discussion by the committee?
It sounds like the land, I mean, it's very valuable and it's got great utility and great potential. So it seemed like it evolved into an opportunity that gives long-term benefit in a variety of ways. It's just we weren't in session and you did what seemed to be expedient and for the, the interest of the state. So it's within that spirit I offer the motion.
So I think at this point we have to call the roll for this.
Oh, do we have a clerk?
We don't. We got advice from legislative counsel, and I think I will let her speak.
So I looked at what you do on JLMC, and I also have been in contact with the Senate Secretary's office, and I've been assured that you do not need to elect the clerk to then have a vote called by the clerk, and that Representative Coffey can call the roll.
Yes. So good, and I appreciate you asking. So, and that's with that, I think we'll start. And so, Senator Cummings?
Yes.
Senator Kitchell? Yes. Representative Kornheiser is absent today. Representative Lamfer?
Yes.
Senator Mazza?
Yes.
Okay, and Representative Coffey, yes. So, great. So I think that just kind of wraps it up. And I appreciate the discussion and the presentation, and look forward to seeing what happens up in Franklin County.
And
So,
Michelle made a lot of phone calls.
Yes.
Gave a lot of explanations.
Yes.
And that was really, I think, helped us feel informed and comfortable.
so thank you. And thank you, Michelle, for taking hours away from your vacation weeks. So
Please second you. Thank you.
really appreciate that. So, so then we can move on to our final agenda item, which is the Caledonia Airport sale and lease updates. I think, Michelle, we have you down to speak to this, and I know Secretary can chime in too.
Thank you very much. So Jane is going to pull up a couple of slides. This is a fairly short story based on where we are in the process, but I want to give you a little background of what led up to where we are in the process, and just the status of where things are going. We'll start with the first slide. So this is all based on the T-bill that you all passed in the session this year, and authorizing the agency to prepare a request for proposals for either purchase or lease of the Caledonia State Airport. And the RFP was issued on August 2nd. And our own contract administration services is managing this process. It was put out through their public bid system. The bids were due on September 13th. And what we can say about the bids is that one proposal was received, which we are reviewing currently according to a scoring criteria, which was outlined in the RFP. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And then following that process, oops, just back one more. Following that process, we'll be moving to negotiations pending the outcome of the scoring of the RFP efforts. And we are using our standard process we use for bids of all types that we would encounter, and that once a contract, lease, or sales agreement is fully executed, at that point, we can release more details publicly about the respondent and their response. All right, so we can now go to the next slide. So one of the elements that was included in the T-bill was that we make sure to engage local and regional government and other entities in the process. And so leading up to the solicitation, we secured not only contacts for the town, but also NVDA, the Regional Economic Development and Planning Organization, as well as secondary and post-secondary institutions in the surrounding communities, Linden Institute, St. Johnsbury Academy, state colleges, and that sort of thing. And then we included contact with these folks, letting them know that our RFP process was coming and that they may be hearing from folks who were interested in applying relative to content that we hoped would be included in responses. And as I mentioned, the Linden Town Manager and the Executive Director of NVDA reviewed the final draft RFP and were invited to comment on it before the solicitation was issued. Next slide. So in terms of like what we were asking for in the RFP, we want to make sure that there's a technical capability and understand the approach of respondents in terms to what they believe our intent and objectives are for the future of this airport and the investments that may need to be made, making sure that the respondents have the capabilities, experience, and the business acumen and business backing to be able to be proactive as they move forward with not only the enhancements required at this airport, which we have estimated that it's about $5 million in improvements, basic improvements that need to be made. So it's not insubstantial, as well as continuing to run the airport and as a public aviation offering for the community. So how they would address current deficiencies, necessary repairs, and continue general aviation uses in perpetuity. Next slide. Additionally, what the regional impacts to the economy and to the educational institutions could be, how they would work with these entities as well as regional businesses and the governmental organizations. We wanted to make sure there was an organizational chart so we knew who was expected to be performing what tasks and how clear lines of communication would be maintained through the sort of future operations of the effort. And next slide. Were there past examples that the respondents could provide where they undertook a project of similar complexity, had relevant experience with aviation entities and airports, and provided references. And then finally, that the fair market value offer would be required under statute and in accordance with the T-bill requirements coming out this spring. Next slide. That's it. So, wow. So at any rate, we had great enthusiasm from the community entities that we approached. I think you had heard some of them testify before your committees earlier this year.
No negatives at all. No negatives at all. I never heard anything like it. Everything was positive. All the select board people,
yeah,
they were just positive. It was just,
yeah.
Couldn't find anyone who was against it, really. It was just.
And similarly, the educational institutions, when I talked to them, they were very interested in furthering opportunities with a future partner at the airport in terms of what kind of training and jobs there might be within this sector that could benefit students both at the high school level and those in college. So it's been a very good process, and we are expecting to finalize our scoring and to evaluate the performance of the submission. And we hopefully within the next month or so, we'll be able to determine if we're ready to move into the negotiation phases of the process. So,
Michelle, I had a question. You used the figure of 5 million that would be. My recollection is we were talking about maybe in the vicinity of 11 million between runway and everything in terms of what it would really take to bring that airport up to really the standards. So that's quite a difference between the 5 and the 11. I just wondered.
Yeah, you're correct. You're correct, Senator Kitchell. The 5 million refers to.
I don't need to say I am if I'm wrong.
We previously testified to higher numbers.
Yeah,
12 million.
The first phase, which would be just to really get the sort of basic operational needs taken care of, the runway refurbished, the safety area, where the tie downs are, getting all of those
That's your 5
Right now,
million.
there's grass growing in the sort of airplane parking areas because the cracks are so wide. So there's some very basic first phase activity that needs to occur. But the secretary and you are right that the sort of second phase activities really are going to be running, about as much or a little bit more that's in today's dollars. So. Secretary Flynn, did you have anything else you wanted to add on this before we answer other questions?
I think you've covered everything well, Michelle. I think, again, I would just emphasize that we're handling this bid exactly as we handle any other bid. I do not know who it's from. I have not seen it. Michelle doesn't know who it's from. She has not seen it. The governor's office hasn't seen it. A contractor, if you will, or a bidder submits a bid to us and it goes to contract administration, which is in Jana's shop. And they vet everything to make sure all of the must-dos, if you will, or the requirements are there. And then, as Michelle said, it goes to scoring before we consider it legitimate as far as accepting it. So, and I just bring this up because I don't believe I felt this way in the legislature or certainly in either committee of jurisdiction. But, there were, I think, some who feel the fix was in, and we don't know. We do not have any elements to this that are of knowledge to us at this point. We are taking this exactly the same process we would a construction project bid. And so until the point where it comes through that process and then it's deemed, it met all of the metrics, and I may not be using the right words. So Jana, please feel free as you run that area. But I just felt that that's important to say for the record.
I would just note that while I am bound by a confidentiality agreement I sign, I am one of the reviewers. And so I have seen the proposal.
Oh, I didn't even know that.
It may not be.
Well, they keep me in the dark.
May not speak about it. Exactly. You're completely in the dark, Secretary. What I would say
Down
is.
on the record. You put the bid in, huh, Joe? I'm actually glad you.
I was just wondering.
We do have state level economic development specialist who does not work for the agency, who is on the review team, along with aviation specialists and myself. And additionally, we have retained a firm which is external to the state, but they are an accounting based firm, business firm, which can do a analysis for us of the business plan and the financial documents that were submitted by the bidder to assure that there is the financial wherewithal to make these investments that we were just discussing. So that will be a part of our input as well.
That's great. That's a terrific update, and I really appreciate hearing all the outreach also to the higher education community there.
A lot's been going on.
Yeah.
Since we adjourned.
So that's just great. So we'll look forward to hearing how that goes. So with that was our final agenda item. We are yes, unless there's other business that anyone wants to.
Do you need a motion to adjourn or?
I saw that. Yeah, I saw that you did this earlier. Yeah, I think I shouldn't have the power to adjourn. So we are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.